The bulldozers arrived before sunrise. By noon, the house that Daniel Carter spent 10 years building was nothing but splintered wood and dust. Standing across the empty lot, Daniel stared silently as construction crews packed up their machines. A large notice had been nailed to the broken mailbox: property demolished due to unpaid HOA dues. Neighbors whispered from their porches, unsure what they had just witnessed. Because Daniel Carter wasn't the kind of man anyone expected this to happen to, be a quiet, responsible, always working late shifts, yet somehow the Homeowners Association claimed he had ignored years of unpaid fees, and they had acted quickly, too quickly. The HOA president, Margaret Collins, stood confidently near the sidewalk holding a clipboard. To maintain community standards, she announced loudly to nearby neighbors, "We had no choice." But Daniel didn't argue, he simply watched the empty lot where his home once stood. And then he asked a single calm question: "Did anyone here verify the records before ordering demolition?" Margaret gave a dismissive shrug. "Our legal department handled everything." The neighbors assumed the situation was finished, but they didn't know something important about Daniel Carter, something Margaret Collins definitely didn't know, because the papers she relied on weren't the only documents connected to that property. And once Daniel finally showed what he carried in his jacket pocket, the entire HOA board would wish they had double-checked everything. Daniel Carter had moved into Ridgewood Estates nearly a decade earlier. Back then the neighborhood felt welcoming: clean streets, friendly neighbors, and an HOA that promised to protect property values. For years, Daniel followed every rule: lawn trimmed, house painted on schedule, fees paid automatically. But things changed when Margaret Collins became HOA president. Under her leadership, enforcement became strict. Sometimes overly strict. Neighbors began receiving warning letters over small details: mailbox color, garden decorations, even parking angles in driveways. Most residents simply complied. Daniel did too, at least at first. But during one particularly busy year at work, Daniel spent months away from home on extended assignments. He trusted his automatic payments to handle everything, or at least he believed they would. According to Margaret Collins, the system showed something different: missed dues, late fees, and eventually, a legal notice claiming the property had fallen into violation status. Daniel never saw those notices. They were mailed to the house while he was away. And by the time he returned home, the HOA had already moved forward with their decision. But Margaret Collins never asked an important question: who exactly was Daniel Carter? Because the quiet homeowner they thought they knew had a second career few neighbors ever suspected. And that secret would soon change everything. By late afternoon, several neighbors had gathered around the empty lot. Some whispered in shock, others simply stared at the destroyed house. Margaret Collins stood proudly beside the demolition permit posted on a wooden stake. The HOA board approved everything legally, she repeated. Daniel finally stepped closer. His expression remained calm. "Can I see the documentation?" he asked. Margaret handed over the folder. Daniel flipped through the pages slowly: late dues, penalty fees, final violation notice, and the demolition authorization. Every document looked official, but something was missing. Daniel closed the folder and handed it back. "You know," he said quietly, "there's usually another step before demolishing a residential property." Margaret crossed her arms. "Our attorneys approved it." Daniel nodded slowly. "I see." One neighbor finally asked the question everyone was thinking: "So, what happens now?" Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Margaret expected him to pull out a payment check, maybe even an apology. Instead, he removed a small leather wallet. From it, he revealed a silver badge. For a moment, the entire street fell silent. Margaret blinked. "Is that?" Daniel held the badge where everyone could see it. "Yes," he said calmly, "and unfortunately for the HOA board." His voice remained steady. "This situation just became a federal investigation." Margaret Collins stared at the badge in Daniel's hand. The confident expression she wore all morning began to fade. "You're law enforcement?" she asked slowly. Daniel nodded. "Federal Housing Compliance Division." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gathered neighbors. Margaret quickly recovered her composure. "Well," she said firmly, "that doesn't change the HOA's authority." Daniel slipped the badge back into his pocket. "No," he agreed, "but it does change how this demolition will be reviewed." Margaret frowned. "What exactly do you mean?" Daniel pointed calmly at the empty lot. "Federal housing regulations require strict procedures before destroying a primary residence." He paused, and several of those steps appear to have been skipped. Margaret's grip tightened on her clipboard. "Our legal team approved everything." Daniel nodded again. "That's good," he said, "because investigators will want to review those approvals." The neighbors looked between them nervously. Margaret tried to regain control of the moment. "You're trying to intimidate the board." Daniel shook his head. No, he looked back at the broken foundation of his home. I'm just explaining what happens next. And what happened next would affect far more than a single house, because the demolition order had triggered something Margaret Collins never expected, an investigation that could examine every decision the HOA had made for years. And that process was about to begin. 2 days later, government vehicles appeared at the entrance of Ridgewood Estates. Neighbors watched quietly as investigators walked door to door collecting documents. The story had spread quickly: an HOA demolition, a federal badge, and now an official review. Margaret Collins spent most of the morning inside the HOA office with several attorneys. Stacks of paperwork covered the conference table. Daniel stood outside near the empty lot where his house once stood. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't angry either. Mostly, he looked tired. One investigator approached him. "We've reviewed the initial files," she said. Daniel nodded, and she sighed. "There are several irregularities." Margaret stepped outside just in time to hear that sentence. "What kind of irregularities?" she demanded. The investigator remained professional: missing notices, improper approval steps, incorrect legal filing procedures. Margaret's face went pale. "That's impossible." The investigator shook her head. "Unfortunately, it isn't." The crowd of neighbors grew larger. For years they believed the HOA board followed every rule carefully, but now questions were appearing, lots of them. Daniel looked around the neighborhood slowly. He hadn't expected the situation to escalate this far, but once the investigation started, the truth became impossible to ignore. And the final discovery would shock everyone watching. By the end of the week, the investigation results became clear. The demolition order had been issued without several legally required steps, key notices had never been verified, and one document contained a critical filing error. Margaret Collins sat silently during the final meeting. The investigator explained everything carefully. "The HOA board acted too quickly," she said. Daniel remained quiet as the report was read aloud, because none of this would bring his house back. But something unexpected happened next. The county official placed a final document on the table. "Due to the improper demolition order," he explained, "the HOA will be responsible for reconstruction costs." Margaret's eyes widened. "Reconstruction?" "Yes," he said, "the property must be restored." Neighbors exchanged stunned looks, because rebuilding a home inside Ridgewood Estates wouldn't be cheap. The HOA board members shifted nervously in their chairs. For years they enforced rules across the community, but now those same rules were being applied to them, and suddenly the power balance inside the neighborhood had completely changed. Yet Daniel hadn't said much during the meeting, he simply watched quietly. Because the biggest surprise wasn't the investigation, or the reconstruction order, it was what Daniel planned to do once the rebuilding began. Spring arrived just as construction started. A new house slowly rose from the same foundation where Daniel's old home once stood. Neighbors stopped by almost every day to watch the progress, but the new design looked different, bigger, more modern, and far more impressive than the original. The county order required the HOA to cover the rebuilding costs: every nail, every beam, every detail. Margaret Collins watched from across the street one afternoon as the final roof panels were installed. Daniel stood nearby speaking with the builders. When he noticed Margaret, he walked over calmly. "I hope the new place improves the neighborhood," he said politely. Margaret looked at the nearly finished home. "It was easily the nicest house on the block. We made a mistake," she admitted quietly. Daniel nodded. "Everyone makes mistakes." He looked around the street, families walking their dogs, kids riding bicycles, neighbors talking again like they used to. Sometimes communities needed difficult moments to reset, and this one had certainly learned a lesson. Because the house they demolished out of authority had returned stronger than ever, and that was the final twist in this unbelievable HOA story. If you love the drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing your thoughts. It really helps this channel grow.